Hi everyone, welcome back for another week of class. This week we're talking about sensation and perception. So here's what we're going to be covering this week. We're going to talk about the basics of sensation and perception, then we'll talk about vision and hearing, touch, taste and smell, and then we'll talk about sensory interactions and disorders. So let's get started talking about the basics of sensation and perception, how we are interacting with the world around us. Stanley Coren said that we do not perceive what is out there, rather we perceive what is in here. Our senses can only inform us of their own status. They can inform us of the electrical status of neurons or the physical or chemical status of the receptors, which really breaks this down into the most basic way that our sensation and our perception works, because really that's all we're really doing is we are taking energy from the outside, converting it into a chemical process, converting it again into an electrical process, and then that's how our body is interacting and understanding the world around us, which is pretty cool when you think about it. So what is the difference between sensation and perception? These are two different concepts. Sensation is the process by which our sensory receptors in our nervous system receive and represent stimuli in our environment. So this is everything coming in from the outside. We sense thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of things every single day. There's lots of stuff going on outside, but we perceive only a fraction of that information. And it's because perception is the process of organizing and interpreting that sensory information, enabling us to recognize meaningful objects in our environment or events. So sensation, our skin is taking in information, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, taking in all this information around us. But our brain can only process so much at one time. So our brain is going to find the patterns in our environment. It's going to take in anything new that we might need to actually pay attention to. Like we talked about a few weeks ago with concepts like change blindness, we may not always pick up on everything that is different in our environment because our brain doesn't think that it's all that important to pay attention to, or it's not causing us immediate harm or threat right now. So, or it may not just be interesting for our brain to pay attention to. Our brain likes to find new and interesting things. So while sensation is happening all of the time, perception is only a small window of that, what we're sensing in our environments. Here's another way to think about this. Going back to our concept of dual processing, remember we talked way back in week 1 about top-down and bottom-up processing. Sensation is going from the world to our brain, utilizing our peripheral nervous system. This is very much a bottom-up process. So we are taking in information from all around us, and it is going up to our brain, and we're just letting it know this is what's going on. Perception, on the other side, is our brain filling in what we're expecting to see or responding to the situation. So that's very much a top-down process. In this office that I have right now, you may not see everything in the background, but you can get the gist of it, and your brain is going to fill in the expectations for what it would be. You can't really see the chair that I'm sitting in right now, but your perception is that I am sitting because that would make sense, right? So that's a top-down process utilizing our central nervous system. In order for the energy transfer from light waves, from sound waves, from chemical smells and tastes, we have to convert one form of energy to another. So that's the light waves, the sound waves, the chemicals. Our brain can't process that kind of information. Our brain functions using neurotransmitters and electrical signals and its own chemicals. So we have to figure out how to convert one form of energy to another. And we call this process transduction. Transduction is taking all of that sensory information, moving it through our sensory receptors, and then we are going to convert that information into electrical signals, and those are going to become neural impulses. Here's another way to look at it. So we have a stimulus energy. Let's say we're making coffee in the morning. And I get up and my sensory receptors, I'm going to see the coffee pot. I'm going to smell that delicious aroma of coffee. Okay, I'm going to hear it dripping from the maker into the little receptacle thing. And that's all coming into my sensory receptors. From those sensory receptors, it's going to come into my brain, into those neurons that are going to convert that energy into a neural impulse to push it throughout my brain to whatever sector of the brain it needs to go to. Whether I'm seeing something and so we need to visualize it, that's the occipital lobe. If I'm hearing something, we know those are the temporal lobes. If I'm smelling something, that's maybe going to go into the frontal cortex or into the thalamus. So we are fully engaging different parts of our brain and converting this energy, going from sensation, taking stuff in from the outside, from our environment, to perception. My brain is going to interpret what is going on out there. So within this idea of sensation and perception, we have a couple thresholds that we need to discuss. The minimum stimulation that we need, it's called the absolute threshold. The minimum stimulation that we need to detect a stimuli 50% of the time. So if I'm listening to the radio and I have to turn it way down because maybe I hear sirens or something, the minute that I hear those sirens is the absolute threshold. The minimum stimulation I need to detect 50% of the time. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we talk about hearing, what it takes for us to get there. Same thing with light. If we're in a dark cave and we're hiking, whatever, the minimum threshold or the absolute threshold is the minimum stimulation I need to see light at the end of the tunnel or when I'm coming back out of the cave. On the other side of that is the subliminal threshold, and that's the stimuli that we cannot detect 50% of the time. It is below that absolute threshold. So when we're listening to the radio in our car, we might have to crank it up to like level 5 before we start hearing anything. Everything below that, there could be sound coming out of the speakers, but it is too low for us to detect. It is below the subliminal threshold. There is a thought that we can prime ourselves to perceive different things. We call this priming, activating unconscious associations. The research is mixed on this. If we can actually do this, it might be that it works, or we believe it works because we want it to work. And this is called the placebo effect. Placebo effect is extremely powerful. The power of belief is very influential over us. If we expect something to happen, if we believe something will happen, then our body and our brain are going to start to believe that as well and start to act accordingly. So research is still out there, but if you see information about subliminal messaging or something that's trying to prime you to think a certain way, it works if you want it to work. And it doesn't if you are paying attention to what's going on in your body. So there's that. Another couple definitions that we need to know about sensation and perception. The difference threshold, also known as the just noticeable difference. This is the minimum difference between two stimuli that a person can detect 50% of the time. So going back to our car radio example, if we're cranking up the radio, what is the minimum difference between level 5 and level 7, between level 5 and level 10. And there is a difference between those, but we may not always detect them. And the size of the just noticeable difference we can measure through something called Weber's law. It looks like Weber's law, but it's pronounced Weber's law. The size of the just noticeable difference is a constant ratio of the original stimulus. And there's a video I want you guys to watch when we were done with this that really demonstrates the Weber's law using sound. And you'll see a guy playing around with his car radio, listening to the Star Wars Imperial March. And so you get to experience that yourselves. If you want to watch that video and then go try it out for yourselves, either listening to a radio or using like a dimmer switch on a light or something, so you can see what it takes for you to notice a difference. And what Weber's law says that change will be consistent in ratio as you go up. So it's easier to hear the difference when sounds are very low, but it takes a lot more to figure out the difference when stuff is really high. So the difference between 5 and 10 and the difference between like 15 and 20 might be a little bit different for you. So once you're done with this video, check it out and let me know what you guys think. Sensory adaptation. This is having a diminished sensitivity as a consequence of constant stimulation. So maybe you're experiencing that right now and you're tuning me out. That's cool. But examples of this: going nose blind to a smelly trash can. If you let trash pile up and you're like, oh my God, that really smells bad, but I'm gonna keep ignoring that because I don't want to take it out. And all of a sudden, you notice that you don't notice how bad your trash smells anymore. You've gone nose blind. Another example, sitting in a chair when you've been sitting still for a while. We can't always feel chairs underneath us. And this is because of sensory adaptation. Our brain just doesn't want to process all this information constantly. It has other stuff to do. Our brains are busy. So sensory adaptation helps us get used to constant stimulation, but our brain doesn't have to pay attention to it as much. So sensory receptor cells become less responsive to a stimulus that is unchanging. Again, this is a peripheral nervous system thing. We just have other stuff to do when we're constantly being bombarded by new sensations. So if something is staying constant, we're not going to pay as much attention to it. On the other side of this, habituation is the tendency for the brain to stop attending to constant unchanging information. So adaptation is a function of the peripheral nervous system. Our sensory receptor cells just are going to stop responding. Habituation is a central nervous system process where our brain is just done, like checking out. I have nothing else that we really need to attend to here.